Valeth had not eaten in 6 days. She knew the feeling well by now. The hollow ache behind her ribs. The way her wings felt too heavy to lift properly. The slow drag in her legs that made every step feel like she was walking through deep mud. She had felt hunger before, many times, in the long cold months when prey was scarce. But this hunger was different. This hunger did not belong to her alone. Back up the mountain, in a narrow cave hidden behind a curtain of dead ivy, 3 small shapes were sleeping. Her hatchlings. Tiny and pale and far too quiet. They had stopped crying 2 days ago, and that silence frightened her more than any sound ever could. A hatchling that stopped crying had stopped hoping. She could not let that happen. She had spent the last 3 days hunting. She had crossed every ridge she knew. She had followed frozen rivers to their sources, searched old meadows, circled the dead forest twice. There was nothing. The long winter had taken everything. The deer were gone. The wild boar had moved south. Even the rabbits had vanished, as if the land itself had decided to hold its breath and offer nothing. And so, as the last light of evening turned the sky a deep and tired orange, Valeth made a decision that went against every instinct she had ever known. She would go to the humans. She had watched their village from the mountain for years. She had seen their fires at night and heard their bells in the morning. She had kept her distance, always, because that was the way things were between dragons and humans. They feared her kind. Her kind avoided theirs. It was an old and unspoken agreement that had kept the peace for generations. But her hatchlings were starving, and peace meant nothing to a mother with hungry children. She came down the mountain slowly, picking her way through the snow-covered rocks with great care. Her claws, which could crack stone, now moved as gently as she could manage. She did not want to look threatening. She did not want to look like a hunter. She wanted to look like what she was, tired, desperate, and out of choices. The village sat at the bottom of the valley, ringed by a low wooden fence that would not have stopped even a young dragon, let alone a full-grown one. Warm light glowed from the windows of the small houses. Smoke curled up from chimneys. The smell of cooked food drifted through the cold air and hit Valeth like a fist, making her stomach twist painfully. She stepped over the fence without touching it and moved into the dirt road that ran between the houses. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a woman came out of a doorway, took one look at Valeth, and screamed. That single scream was all it took. Doors flew open. People poured out into the road, took one look at the enormous dragon standing in their village, and ran. Men dropped their tools. Women grabbed their children. An old man fell off his porch steps in his hurry to get away. Within the space of a single minute, the road was completely empty. Almost completely empty. One man had not run. He was standing near the fence on the far side of the road, beside a wooden cart loaded with hay. He was not young. His hair was gray at the sides and his face was lined from years of working outdoors. His coat was patched at the elbows and his boots were muddy. He held a pitchfork loosely in one hand, not raised, not pointed, just held. Like he had forgotten it was there. His name was Gerald, and he was staring at Valeth with an expression that was not fear. It was something closer to careful attention. Like a man watching something he did not fully understand yet and had decided to think about before reacting. Valeth stopped walking. She and Gerald looked at each other across the empty road for a long moment. The village was silent around them. Somewhere behind a closed door, a child was crying softly. The wind moved through the space between them, carrying ash and cold and the smell of hay. Then Valeth did something that cost her more pride than anything she had ever done in her long life. She lowered her head. Not the way a dragon lowers its head before a fight, chin tucked and eyes sharp. She lowered it the way a creature lowers its head when it has nothing left. Slowly. All the way down until her great jaw was nearly resting on the frozen dirt of the road. She stretched her front legs forward and opened her claws wide, turning them upward so that the empty palms faced the sky. It was the oldest gesture she knew. Older than words. Older than fire. It meant, I have nothing. I am asking. Gerald did not move for a long time. Valeth could hear her own heartbeat. She could feel the cold of the ground through the scales of her chin. She waited, because there was nothing else she could do. She had crossed every ridge. She had searched every valley. She had swallowed her pride and walked into a village full of terrified humans and made herself as small and unthreatening as a creature her size possibly could. If this did not work, she did not know what she would do. Gerald set the pitchfork down against the cart. He did it quietly, without any sudden movements. Then he took a slow step forward, and then another, and then he stopped a few feet away from her lowered head and crouched down so that his eyes were closer to level with hers. He looked at her for a long moment. At the sharp ridges of her ribs pressing through her scales. At the way her wings hung loose and trembling at her sides. At the dullness in her eyes that no healthy creature should have. He let out a slow breath through his nose. Then he stood up, turned around, and walked toward his barn. Valeth lifted her head just enough to watch him go. She did not know what he was doing. She did not know if he was leaving to get a weapon, or to fetch the other villagers, or simply to get as far away from her as he could manage. She waited. The barn door opened. Gerald came back out carrying a large cloth sack in both arms. He walked back across the road, set the sack down on the ground a few feet in front of her, and opened it. The smell that came out of it made Valetha's whole body go still. Dried meat. Salted fish. Hard bread. Not much. Not nearly enough. But real food, set down in front of her by a human who had not run. Gerald stepped back and crossed his arms and said nothing. Valeth looked at the food. She looked at him. She looked at the food again. Then she ate, slowly and carefully, like she was trying not to frighten him. And Gerald stood in the cold road of his empty village and watched her, and did not leave, and did not look away. Neither of them knew yet how much that single moment would change everything. The next morning came cold and grey, with frost on every windowsill and ice in the water troughs. Gerald was up before the sun. He had not slept well. Not because he was afraid, though any sensible man would have been. He had not slept well because he kept thinking about those ribs. The way they had pressed through Valetha's scales like the bars of an empty cage. The way she had eaten, not greedily, not like a predator finally getting its fill, but carefully, slowly, like every bite was being counted and saved for something. He had seen that kind of eating before. He had seen it in bad winters, in families who were stretching the last of their food as far as it would go. He had seen it in his own home, once, a long time ago, when he was very young and the harvest had failed 2 years in a row. He knew what it looked like when someone was not eating for themselves. He pulled on his coat and went out to the barn. Valeth was still there. She had curled herself against the outer wall of the barn during the night, her great body pressed close to the wood where the wall blocked the wind. She was awake when he came out. Her eyes followed him the moment he stepped through the door, steady and quiet and full of something he could not quite name. Gerald looked at what was left in his barn. 2 sides of salted pork hanging from the rafters. A barrel of dried fish he had been saving for spring. Some hard cheese wrapped in cloth. A small sack of old grain that was no good for bread anymore. He looked at it all and then he looked at Valeth through the open barn door and he did a rough calculation in his head. It was not enough. Not even close. He sat down on a hay bale and rubbed his face with both hands and thought. By the time the sun had fully risen, he had made up his mind. He took everything from the barn that could be eaten and brought it out to Valeth in 2 trips. He set it all in front of her without ceremony and watched her eat. Then he went inside, counted the coins in the old tin box he kept under the floorboard by the fireplace, put them all in his coat pocket, and set out for the neighboring farms. The first farm belonged to a man named Ray, who was broad and quiet and grew more than he ever needed. Gerald knocked on his door and asked to buy whatever surplus livestock Ray could spare. Ray looked at him for a long moment and then asked why. Gerald told him the truth. Ray stared at him. Then he laughed, a short hard sound, and told Gerald he had lost his mind. Gerald agreed that it was possible, paid for 2 old sheep that were past their wool-giving years, and led them back down the road toward his farm. Velith ate both sheep before noon. Gerald went to 2 more farms that afternoon. He spent nearly everything in the tin box. By evening he had fed Velith more than he had fed himself in a week, and she still looked thin, but her eyes were a little brighter, and her wings had stopped trembling quite so badly. He counted what was left of his money that night by candlelight and did not let himself worry about it. The trouble came the next morning in the form of Sid. Sid was the village elder, a tall narrow man with white hair and a voice that was used to being listened to. He came to Gerald's farm just after breakfast, walking fast, with 3 other men from the village behind him like a shadow with too many parts. Gerald saw them coming and stayed where he was, leaning on the fence post by the road. Sid stopped a few feet away and looked past Gerald to where Velith was lying in the thin morning sun beside the barn, eyes half closed. Then he looked back at Gerald with an expression that was not quite anger and not quite fear but somewhere uncomfortable between the two. He told Gerald that what he was doing was dangerous. That feeding a dragon was like feeding a wolf, sooner or later it would stop being grateful and start being hungry in a different way. He told Gerald that the village had families, children, people who could not defend themselves if things went wrong. He said it all in a firm, reasonable voice that clearly expected to be agreed with. Gerald listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he shook his head once and said nothing. Sid's expression shifted. He asked Gerald if he understood what he was saying. Gerald said he did. Sid told him the village could not protect him if something happened. Gerald said he had not asked for protection. Sid told him to drive the dragon away before someone got hurt. Gerald looked at him for a moment. Then he turned and looked at Velith. She had opened her eyes during the conversation and was watching the group of men with a stillness that was not aggression but was very, very alert. Gerald turned back to Sid and told him something that Sid had clearly not expected. He said that he had looked into that dragon's eyes the first evening she came to the village. Not a quick look, not a frightened glance, but a real look. And what he had seen there was not hunger for flesh or territory or violence. What he had seen was the same thing he had seen in every mother he had ever known who was running out of ways to help her children. A kind of desperate, quiet love that had nowhere left to go. He said that an animal that comes to beg instead of to hunt is not the thing you need to be afraid of. Sid stared at him. The 3 men behind him shifted uncomfortably. Then Sid told Gerald that it was his farm and his choice, and if he wanted to ruin himself feeding a dragon, that was his own business. But he wanted it known that he had warned him. He turned around and walked back toward the village with his shadow following behind. Gerald watched them go. Then he turned back to Velith, who was still watching him with those steady, ancient eyes. He walked over to the fence nearest to her and leaned on it with his arms folded. She lifted her head slowly and turned to face him fully. Up close, even lying down, she was enormous. Her scales were the deep greenish gray of old river stones. Her eyes were gold, very pale, like winter sunlight on still water. Gerald looked at her and said, quietly, that he was going to need her to trust him for a little while longer. He was not sure she understood his words. But she lowered her head slowly, in that same gesture she had used the first evening, the one that meant something older than language. And Gerald nodded back at her, pushed off the fence, and went to count his coins again. It was on the 4th day that Velith did something unexpected. Gerald had come out in the early morning as usual, carrying what was left of the salted pork and a bucket of water from the well. He set everything down in front of her and stepped back, the way he always did, giving her space to eat without feeling crowded. She had learned his routine by now, and he had learned hers. It was a quiet and careful arrangement between two creatures who did not fully understand each other but had decided to try anyway. But that morning, Valeth did not eat. She looked at the food. Then she looked at Gerald. Then she stood up, slowly, all the great weight of her rising from the frozen ground, and she turned toward the mountain trail that led up behind the farm. She took 3 steps and stopped. Then she turned her head and looked back at Gerald. Gerald stood with the empty bucket in his hand and looked at her. She turned back toward the trail. Then she looked at him again. Her tail moved once, slowly, in a way that was not threatening. More like a question. Gerald set the bucket down. He understood. He pulled his coat tighter, tucked the remaining food under his arm, and walked toward her. When he reached her side, she turned back to the trail and began to walk, slowly enough that he could follow. Gerald fell into step behind her, his boots crunching on the frozen ground, his breath making small clouds in the cold morning air. They walked for a long time. The trail was steep and narrow in places, winding up through bare trees and over loose rocks that were slippery with frost. Gerald was not a young man and the climb was hard on his knees, but he did not stop and he did not complain. Valeth moved carefully ahead of him, picking the easiest path without him asking, stepping around the worst of the ice, keeping her pace steady and slow. After about an hour the trail leveled out onto a wide rocky shelf halfway up the mountain. The view behind them was long and pale, the village a small cluster of dark shapes far below in the white valley. Gerald stopped for a moment to catch his breath and then followed Valeth to the far edge of the shelf, where the rock face curved inward and formed a shallow cave hidden behind a thick curtain of dead ivy. Valeth pushed the ivy aside with her nose and looked back at Gerald one more time. Her eyes were different in that moment. Not the steady, watchful look she wore most of the time. Something more open. Something that, on a human face, Gerald would have called nervous. He nodded at her and stepped inside. The cave was low and wide, the floor lined with dry leaves and old moss that Valeth had clearly gathered over a long time. It was warmer inside than out, sheltered from the wind, and it smelled of earth and something warm and faintly smoky. Gerald blinked in the dim light and looked toward the back of the cave. 3 small shapes were huddled together in the deepest corner. Gerald went very still. They were tiny. That was the first thing that struck him. He had imagined dragon hatchlings as small versions of Valeth, scaled down but still fierce, still sharp. But these 3 were nothing like that. They were smaller than barn cats, curled tightly together for warmth, their scales still pale and soft-looking, not yet hardened into the tough armor they would one day become. Their wings were folded flat against their bodies. Their eyes were closed. They were barely moving. Gerald crouched down slowly and set the food on the ground beside him. He could see their ribs moving with each breath, shallow and slow. One of them, the smallest, had its head resting on the back of another, its tiny legs tucked under its body. Its color was lighter than the other 2, almost the pale orange of a dying coal. Gerald sat down on the cave floor, not caring about the cold or the damp, and just looked at them for a long moment. Behind him, Valeth had come in and lowered herself to the ground near the entrance, watching him watch her young. She made no sound. She simply waited. Gerald opened the cloth he had brought the food in and tore a piece of dried meat into very small pieces, as small as he could make them. Then he shuffled forward on his knees toward the hatchlings, moving as slowly as he possibly could. The closest one stirred at the smell of the food. Its eyes opened, pale gold, unfocused, blinking slowly in the dim light. It lifted its head about an inch and then let it drop again as if the effort had been too much. Gerald held a small piece of meat close to its nose. The hatchling's nostrils moved. Its head lifted again, shakier this time but more determined. It opened its mouth, and Gerald placed the piece of meat carefully on its tongue. The hatchling swallowed. Then it opened its mouth again. Gerald fed it slowly, piece by piece, not rushing, talking softly to it the whole time in a low and steady voice. He said nothing important. He talked about the weather, about the farm, about the walk up the mountain. The words did not matter. The tone did. He had learned that long ago with frightened animals, the words were just sounds, but the voice behind them told the truth. After a while the second hatchling woke and nudged toward him, and he fed that one too. It was stronger than the first, more alert, and it snapped at his fingers once, more out of confusion than aggression. Gerald did not pull back. He just waited until it settled and kept feeding it. Then he turned to the smallest one. The pale one. It had not moved. Gerald shuffled closer and bent down. He could see it breathing, just barely. He tore the smallest piece of meat he could manage and held it right at the tip of its nose. For a long moment nothing happened. Then, very slowly, the tiny head lifted. The eyes that opened were darker than the others, a deeper gold, more amber than yellow. They looked up at Gerald with an expression that was too tired to be afraid. Gerald placed the piece of meat on its tongue. It swallowed. And then something happened that Gerald had not expected. The tiny claws, no bigger than a cat's, reached out and closed around his index finger. Not a grip of fear. Not a grip of hunger. Just a small, exhausted, trusting grip that said, simply, "You are warm and I am not, and I would like to stay near you for a while." Gerald did not move his hand. He sat there in that cold mountain cave through the rest of the morning and into the afternoon, feeding 3 dragon hatchlings by hand while their mother watched from the entrance with pale gold eyes. He pulled the spare blanket he had thought to bring from inside his coat and tucked it around the smallest one without letting go of her grip on his finger. He did not name any of them out loud. But somewhere in the quiet of that cave, looking down at the tiny pale hatchling sleeping against his hand, a name came to him anyway. Ember. It suited her. Small and low and almost gone, but still burning. The story of Gerald and the dragon had spread through the village the way all stories spread in small places. Fast, and with extra details that nobody could quite confirm. By the end of the first week, half the village believed Gerald had lost his mind. The other half believed he was going to get everyone killed. A few people believed both things at the same time. The only thing everyone agreed on was that something had to be done, and that Sid was the one who needed to do it. Sid had already spoken to Gerald once and gotten nowhere. That had not improved his mood. He spent 3 days listening to his neighbors knock on his door one after another, each one with a fresh reason why the dragon needed to go and why it was his responsibility to make that happen. By the 4th day he had heard enough. He called a meeting in the village hall. Nearly everyone came. The hall was small and the crowd made it smaller, people pressed together on benches and standing along the walls, their breath fogging in the cold air because the fire had not been lit yet. Gerald sat near the back, alone, with his coat still on and his hands folded in his lap. He had heard about the meeting from Dot the baker, who had told him about it in the tone of someone warning a man that a storm was coming. Sid stood at the front and laid out the situation plainly. A full-grown dragon was living against Gerald's barn. Gerald was feeding it from his own savings. The dragon was a danger to the village, to the farms, to the children, and to the livestock of every family present. It needed to be driven away. Sid proposed that the men of the village go together, in a group large enough that the dragon would not risk a fight, and make it clear that it was not welcome. He asked if anyone disagreed. Gerald raised his hand. Sid looked at him with the expression of a man who had expected exactly this and was tired of it already. He asked Gerald to speak. Gerald stood up. He was not a tall man and he was not a loud one. He did not have the kind of voice that filled a room naturally. But the room was very quiet and he spoke clearly and everyone heard him. He told them about the mountain cave. He described the 3 hatchlings, how small they were, how still, how close to the edge they had been. He described feeding them by hand in the cold and the dark while their mother lay at the cave entrance watching with eyes that never blinked. He told them about the smallest one, Ember, and how she had gripped his finger and held on. The room was very quiet when he finished. Then a man near the front said that it did not matter. A dragon was a dragon. It would grow and it would become dangerous, and sympathy now would cost them dearly later. Several people nodded. Someone else said that Gerald had no right to put the whole village at risk for the sake of his own feelings about an animal. More nodding. Sid told Gerald that he was sorry, but the decision of the village had to come first. Gerald looked around the room. He looked at the nodding faces and the crossed arms and the tight, worried expressions of people who were not cruel but were afraid, which sometimes looked the same from the outside. He thought about saying more. He thought about arguing, about pressing harder, about finding better words. Instead he said one thing, quietly, almost to himself as much as to the room. He said that a mother who walks into a place that terrifies her and lowers her head to the ground and opens her empty claws and asks for help is not a monster. She is just a mother. And there is nothing more honest in the world than that. Then he put on his hat and walked out. The room stayed quiet for a moment after the door closed behind him. Then a voice spoke up from the left side of the hall. It was Mara. She was 17, the daughter of a farmer on the east side of the village, and she was not the sort of person who usually spoke at village meetings. But she stood up with a basket over her arm, a basket that had bread and hard cheese and 2 parcels of dried meat in it, and she said in a clear voice that she was going to Gerald's farm. Sid stared at her. Mara looked back at him without blinking and said that she had a little sister. And if she and her little sister were ever cold and starving and out of choices, she hoped that someone would do for them what Gerald was doing for those hatchlings. Then she walked out the door. The silence she left behind was a different kind of silence than the one Gerald had left. It had something uncomfortable in it. Something that made people shift in their seats and look at their hands. Len the shepherd was the next one to stand. He was a big quiet man who said very little as a general rule. He stood up, nodded once at no one in particular, and walked out without a word. Everyone knew he had 3 daughters at home. Nobody said anything. Then the baker got up from her bench near the wall. She was a small round woman who had fed half the village through the last hard winter and never asked for thanks. She picked up her coat and her bag and told Sid in a pleasant voice that she had some leftover loaves that needed using up anyway, and that she might as well bring them somewhere useful. Then she left. After that the meeting fell apart in the way that meetings fall apart when the feeling in the room has quietly changed direction without anyone announcing it. People began to talk to each other in low voices. Some of them left. A few stayed and argued with Sid, but with less certainty than before. Gerald was back at his farm by the time Mara arrived. He was standing at the fence, not doing anything in particular, when he heard footsteps on the road and turned to see her coming toward him with her basket. He looked surprised. She told him she had brought food and asked where she should put it. Gerald pointed at the area near the barn where Valeth was resting. Mara walked right up to within 10 feet of the dragon, set the basket down firmly, and stepped back. Valeth opened one eye and regarded her with calm, ancient patience. Mara looked at her steadily and then nodded, as if she had asked a question and received an acceptable answer. Len arrived 20 minutes later with a sheep he said was too old to be useful. Dot came after him with a cloth bag full of bread ends and meat scraps. 2 more families arrived before evening, quietly, without making a fuss, setting down what they had brought and going home without much conversation. Sid did not come. But by the time the sun went down, there was more food by Gerald's barn than there had been in a week. Gerald stood in the cold evening air and looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at Valeth, who was watching him with those steady pale gold eyes. He did not say anything. But he thought that sometimes the world surprised you, if you gave it a reason to. 3 weeks passed, and the change in Valeth was something the whole village could see. She was not the hollow, trembling creature that had crept into the village at dusk with her head bowed to the dirt. Her scales had deepened in color, back to the rich greenish-gray of river stone in full sunlight. Her wings, when she stretched them in the morning, spread wide and steady without shaking. She moved with a weight and a quiet confidence that she had not had before, the kind that comes not from pride but from simply being well enough to stand straight again. The hatchlings had changed even more. Gerald visited the cave every other day, sometimes alone, sometimes with Mara or Len or Dot walking alongside him up the trail. The two older hatchlings were tumbling over each other now, play-fighting with small clumsy swipes that had no real force behind them, chasing each other around the cave and occasionally falling over their own feet in a way that made Mara laugh every single time. They had grown fast. Their scales had hardened slightly and taken on color, one a dark green, one a deep brownish red. Ember was still the smallest. But she was not frail anymore. She had filled out slowly but steadily, her pale orange scales brightening as she grew stronger, her eyes sharper and more alert with each visit. She still made her way to Gerald every time he entered the cave, still found his hand and held on to whatever finger she could reach. But now she did it with energy rather than exhaustion, tugging at him, pulling his sleeve, demanding attention in the way of a young creature that has decided it belongs to someone and is very certain of it. Gerald never discouraged her. He knew, in the quiet practical part of his mind, that this was going to end. Valith was a wild dragon with territory to reclaim and a life to return to. The hatchlings would follow their mother when she was ready to go. That was right and natural and good, and Gerald was glad for it. He had never wanted to keep them. He had only wanted them to live. Still, he did not think about the ending more than he had to. The morning it came was a clear one, cold but bright, with a sky so pale blue it looked almost white at the edges. Gerald was splitting wood by the barn when he heard Valith make a sound he had not heard her make before. Not a growl or a hiss or the low steady exhale that meant she was calm. Something deeper. A long, low sound that moved through the air like a bell that was too large for the space around it. He set down his axe and walked to the corner of the barn. Valith was standing in the open area between the barn and the fence, fully upright, her wings half open. The three hatchlings were clustered around her feet, the two older ones pressing close to her legs, Ember sitting slightly apart, looking toward Gerald with her head tilted. Gerald stopped walking. He understood without being told. He had been a farmer long enough to know when something was leaving. He stood where he was and let himself look at them all for a moment. At Valith, tall and steady and strong again. At the two older hatchlings, round and bright-eyed and full of a life that had nearly not happened. At Ember, small and pale orange in the morning light, watching him with those dark amber eyes. Then Valith did something that Gerald would spend the rest of his life struggling to describe to anyone who asked. She folded her wings back against her body. She lowered her head, slowly, the same way she had lowered it that first evening in the empty road, all the way down until her jaw was close to the ground. But this time she did not open her claws. This time she simply stayed there, head bowed, in a stillness that felt like something very old and very deliberate. And then she spoke. The sound that came out of her was not the language of dragons, the deep vibrations and clicking tones that Gerald had heard her use with her hatchlings. It was something else. The words were slow and carefully shaped, each one separate from the next, like stones being placed one at a time with great care. She said, "My children live because of you." Her voice was low and rough and accented in a way that belonged to no human language Gerald had ever heard, but the words were clear. Absolutely clear. Gerald stood very still and felt something move through his chest that he could not name, something that was not quite sadness and not quite joy but sat right between the two like a place where both things were true at once. He did not know what to say. So he did what he had done that very first evening. He nodded. Once, simply, the way he had nodded back at her when she had made her gesture of asking and he had understood it. Valith raised her head. She turned and looked at Ember. Ember looked back at her mother for a long moment. Something passed between them that Gerald could not read, quiet and still, the way deep things usually are. Then Ember turned and walked across the frozen ground toward Gerald, her small feet making soft sounds on the frost, and sat down on top of his left boot. Gerald looked down at her. Ember looked up at him. Gerald looked back at Valeth. She was watching him steadily, her pale gold eyes calm and clear. This was not abandonment. He understood that completely. This was not a mother leaving a child behind. This was something chosen, freely, by both of them, a thread tied between two kinds of creature who had found something in each other worth holding on to. He reached down and put his hand on Ember's back. She pressed upward against his palm. Valeth watched for one more moment. Then she turned, spread her great wings to their full width, and lifted into the cold morning air with a sound like wind through a very large door. The two older hatchlings scrambled after her, their smaller wings working hard, rising in wobbling spirals that slowly steadied as they climbed. Gerald watched them go up, getting smaller against the pale blue sky, until they were three dark shapes above the mountain and then nothing at all. The village was very quiet. Gerald stood in the cold morning with his hand still resting on Ember's back and looked at the empty sky for a long time. Then he looked down at her. She was looking up at him with an expression that was entirely untroubled, as if the matter had been settled long ago and she saw no reason to make a fuss about it now. Gerald almost smiled. He picked up his axe, walked back to the woodpile, and went back to work. Ember followed him, settled herself on the nearest fence post, and watched him with those steady amber eyes. The sky above was pale and wide and full of nothing but clean cold air. And for the first time in a very long season, the cold did not feel like something to endure. It just felt like morning.